Okay, perfect. So here we have on the screen up here, we have, and I'll just make that a little bit larger for everyone in the room. What we have is Django admin.py, and we can see that the version that we are using is 1.6. And so if we go into our work project and we have our Django project, let's say this is a simple Django project we are working on. This is a 1.6 project, again, using South. So if we were to take a look at the installed apps, we would see South is in there for database migrations. So let's say we're at our day job and we're doing our code, we're writing some new code. We add a new column to one of the database models, and then we run our Django Python manage.py migrate, which goes through South. We do our migrate, everything looks good. We check in our code. It is Friday afternoon, and we say, I'm out of here. Like, I'm done for the week. Now, 1.6, perfectly stable version of Django, but we want to use on our side project. We're starting to think of what side project could I create in order to keep my skills up so that when we eventually upgrade our work project from 1.6 to 1.8, we're ready for it. So there's some changes to Django. For example, South was for 1.6 and prior versions to do migrations, but in Django 1.7, migrations were introduced into the core framework. So this is a switch. Now when we go to Django 1.8 for our side project, we don't have to worry about using South. So we're going to go ahead and install, let's say this is for we're at home on the weekend, and we say, okay, I'm going to start a side project with Django 1.8. So we do sudo pip install, and we say Django equals 1.8. And we just say, okay, let's go ahead and download 1.8. And this is going to install as a Python package into our environment. Now, while we're waiting for that to install, let's come up with the idea for our side project. So we want our side project, if we're going to spend our own personal time working on it, we want to make sure it goes viral. So we combine pets, cats and dogs, which of course always go viral, with Tinder, which is one of the great apps of the last couple of years. So we have this idea. We're going to create Tinder for pets. So pets can decide whether they how they can rate other pets. Do I like this other pet? So this is our side project. We're like, this is definitely going viral. And I'm creating a Django app in 1.8 that is going to implement Tinder for pets. So now, when we take a look at our Django admin.py, we've installed Django 1.8, and we can say, what version do we have here? Okay, we've got 1.8 up on the screen. And it's a little bit cut off there, so I will just make sure that I move it over so we can see all the output that is on the screen here. Okay. So Python, or Django admin.py, and we will start our project, and we'll just call this thing, now we are in our work project directory, so we need to go up one level. So we have our work project, that's separate, and then we're going to create our side project. So Django admin.py, start project, side proj, call it side proj. Okay, go into side proj, and we'll do Python manage.py, start app, Tinder for pets. Okay, we work on our Tinder for pets application, and we unfortunately don't have time to finish it over the weekend. So it's the end of the weekend, we're like, all right, I'll finish it next weekend. And we go to bed. Next morning, wake up, go to work, start working on our work project, add a new column to a database table. We do Python manage.py migrate so we can apply the migrations. And what happens? We get an error. This is not the expected behavior. What's happening here is that that SQLite does not work with Django 1.8 migrations. And we suddenly realize, oh right, I'm on Django 1.8. I should be using Django 1.6 for work. Should I uninstall? Should I reinstall? Which point release were we using for Django? I don't remember. So this is what is called the dependencies problem that we run into. So the dependencies problem is we may have multiple work projects, multiple side projects, and what we see is our work project may be running one version of Python, one version of Django, many different dependencies, different point releases even, and our side project, we don't have the legacy code, so we can use the latest and greatest. What happens if we multiply the work projects? Some of us are working on 5 or 10 projects at a time. Or what if we're working on multiple side projects? Suddenly, the dependencies multiply, and we have so many of them, and that's the dependencies problem. So to describe a little bit more about what happened here, how we got ourselves into this situation, and how we solve it with VirtualEnv, Renee's going to take over.
Thanks, Matt. Can you guys hear me? Great. All right. So what was going on when we installed Django 1.8 over the weekend was we have our system-wide Python interpreter and our system-wide site packages that stores all the libraries our computer uses. And when we installed 1.6 for work, we had that installed in our system-wide Python. Then over the weekend, we did pip install Django 1.8, and that overrode what we had in 1.6, and we were using 1.8. So that when we went back to work on Monday, we had overridden 1.6 and we couldn't use any of our old 1.6 syntax to manage our schema migration. So this is bad. It entails that every time we switch projects, we have to override our system Python. Better to start from the beginning with 2 separate virtual environments so that when you're at work, you can always be using 1.6 until you need to upgrade that version. And then when you're at home, you can always be using 1.8 until you're ready to change that. So, to keep them separate, we would start 2 separate virtual environments, which Matt is going to do now, live. So, he's got his 2 directories for work and side projects, and he's going to make a separate directory for his virtual environments. These are the environments that will store the environment-specific, the project-specific versions of Django. So he makes one first for his work projects, and it installs everything, and he does the familiar syntax source bin activate, which activates the virtual environment, and you know that you're in your work virtual environment because work project shows up at the cursor. So he's in his new work project virtual environment, and he starts up Python and imports Django to get started on his work project. And we can see that Django is suddenly not installed in the work project virtual environment. We have a clean slate as far as Django is concerned, so we're free to install Django 1.6. So while that's installing, it goes ahead and installs successfully. And so now, this time when we start up Python and try to import Django, we see that we have it. And when we check the version of Django we see that we have the right one, which is Django 1.6. Great. So we can have a productive week at work. We can work on Django 1.6, and we're not messing with anything outside of our work virtual environment. So Friday comes along, we can go ahead and deactivate this virtual environment and go and start working on our side project. So Friday night, Saturday morning, we can create a new virtual environment, this one exclusively for our side project and all the libraries that it will need. We activate our side project with source bin activate on our side project virtual environment. And when we start up Python here, we can go ahead and try to import Django. And again, we don't have Django installed on this virtual environment. We have a clean slate within our side project virtual environment. So we are free to install Django 1.8 for our side project so that we can use 1.8 for all of our side project needs. So we go ahead and install it, fire up Python again. We know that we have Django installed, and when we see which version we have, fortunately we have Django 1.8. So now we have 2 completely separate installations of Django. They can work completely separate from each other, and we can flip between our work and our side projects without getting into a dependencies mess. Great. So what exactly happened here? How is it that we were able to keep these 2 versions of Django separate, whereas before we were installing it, they were getting overridden with each other? Well, what happens when you create 2 separate virtual environments is it actually creates 2 directories, a work project env directory and a side project env directory. So instead of installing into your lib site packages on your system-wide Python, it creates a new lib site packages in the work project virtual environment directory and a site packages in the side project virtual env directory. And it doesn't just create 2 separate lib site packages folders, it creates 2 bin executables folders where 2 completely separate versions of the Python executable get downloaded. That's how you can use Python 3 in one project and Python 2 in another project. When you evoke Python, instead of running the system-wide Python that you have, it will run the specific Python version that is in the virtual environment you're in. So if you're activated the work project the work project virtual environment, it will use that version of Python that's installed in the bin executables for work project. And then when trying to decide which version of Django to use, if you import Django in your work virtual environment, Python looks for the relative lib site packages folder, the one that's relative to the version of Python that you're running, and it will use that version of the library. And if it doesn't find something there, then it'll say there's no module named Django. So that's what virtualenv is. It's not two completely separate environments at all, actually. It's just a file system helper that keeps your projects organized. So now the question is, how does virtualenv know to only use one folder in one project and use another folder, another project? And to know that, you just have to understand the path variable. So if you do echo path in your terminal, that'll just output all the places where your system will look when you're trying to execute something. So for example, if you said, Python, do something for me, in this example with echo path, this is without any virtual environment activated, it'll first look under user local bin and say, oh, do I have Python installed in this directory? And if it doesn't, then it'll go look in user bin and say, hey, do I have Python downloaded here? And so on and so forth. So that's how path works in a normal condition. When you run source bin activate, the command to activate a virtual environment, all that happens is it grabs the path to your virtual environment all the way down to the end folder where bin is, and all it does is it copies that onto the beginning of your path environment variable. So if you did echo path while your virtual environment was activated, you'd see something like this. It'd be all the same paths, but at the very top, you'd see the path to your virtual environment. That means that when you say, now, Python, do something for me, it'll first look under the virtual environment we created and say, do I have a version of Python there? And if it does, which it should, then it'll say, okay, great, I'm going to use this version of Python. And when you say import Django, it'll look in the relative site packages directory and say, do I have a version of Django installed? And if it does, then it'll go ahead and use that version of Django. It won't look under the system packages at all unless you don't have something installed in your virtualenv Python. So that's how virtualenv works. Again, it's not two completely separate environments at all. It's just a file system convenience and a script that modifies your path variable. So now that you know a little bit about how it works, Matt's going to tell you about how to use it and how to make it a little bit easier to use.
Sure. Thanks, Renee. So I'm going to go into some tips and tricks. But before I do that, I will say we are very fortunate in the Python community that the majority of the code that we use is open source. And so we've shown what the dependencies problem is. We've shown how virtualenv can solve that. We've shown that virtualenv is not magic under the covers. We sometimes use tools without thinking about what's actually happening. But we can actually take a look at the code behind it. And so as you use virtualenv on a daily basis with your Python projects, I recommend actually going to GitHub. There's a single Python file, virtualenv.py, and you can see how this was put together. It's a good learning opportunity if you're still new to Python and just trying to figure out, well, what is this virtualenv thing? I've been using it every day. I get that it creates a separate directory every time I invoke it, but what's actually happening under the covers? So take a look at the source code behind it. All right, so we need some convenience functions. What happens when we have 50 virtualenvs? This can be a pain in the butt to remember. All right, which ones do I have available, and what about switching back and forth between them? And there's also one other component that is really important. Virtualenvs are for dependency isolation. They don't handle something that is also critical to using different projects, which is called environment variables. So in one project, we may have set debug to true, and in another project, we set debug to false. And we may have 40 or 50 environment variables. What database are we connecting to? Different things like that. What installed apps do we have? And we want to pull those environment variables for our system. So the way that I handle this personally, and there's a few different ways we can do this. We'll take a look at them. I handle this with shell aliases. And what this does is, in my batch profile on Mac OS X, I have an alias set up for workproj. What this does is whenever I type workproj, it will do a source bin activate on my workproj virtualenv. It will change me into the directory of workproj where my source code is, and then it will invoke a shell script, which is set envs.sh. It will set my environment variables that are specified in there. And we haven't written that set envs yet, so we'll write that in just a moment. But I wanted to show you what that looks like.
So if we type workproj right now, it will activate the virtualenv, so we can see here that we've changed from sideproj to workproj, and I will bring this up again. And then the second thing is it moved us into the workproj source code directory, but we don't have that set envs file. So we'll say set envs.sh, and we'll say export debug is equal to true. Now, before we run this, let's take a look at what debug is set to right now. It's blank. But if we do workproj, it's running that shell script, and then we can say echo debug set to true. Now we can do this for whatever environment, whatever project that we're working on. We can invoke a shell script that will set the environment variables that we need. So for example, if we had to do this on sideproj, so if we just copy this real quick and we say sideproj, and we change workproj to sideproj, and then we say, I don't want to switch into workproj, I want to switch into my side project, and then we could invoke the shell script there. And one thing to note is that we need to reload our bash profile. So we would do a source bash profile, and now this is reloaded. So the command that I just wrote in there is now active. So we can say sideproj, it will activate the sideproj virtualenv, switch me into the sideproj directory, and it tried to invoke the shell script with my environment variables. Well, that didn't exist. So we could write that, but we're not going to worry about that. So there's one way. That's actually how I handle switching between environments. I just type in workproj or sideproj or whatever. I just usually have an acronym for whatever projects I'm working on. One way to handle it. Now, just to note, if you are on Mac OS X, that would be the bash profile. That is the second one there. If you're on Linux, it's the .bashrc file. So depending on which operating system you're on, that's where you would add your shell aliases. Now, there's another way we could handle this. There's a Python, or really just a library that we could use in general. It's not Python specific, but it's called Autoam. And what Autoam does, it essentially does the same thing, but it looks for a specific file. It's looking for a .env file. So if we were to use Autoam, so I've already gone ahead and installed this for the sake of time. And we have bash profile. We take a look down here at the bottom two lines. We have a source, and we activate the shell script. What it's doing is it's, I wouldn't say hijacking. Hijacking is probably a negative connotation, but it is adding some additional functionality to the change directory command. So when we change into a directory, if there is a .env file in that directory, it will attempt to run that shell script. So if we have in our side project, we don't have a set envs in our side project, we could do a .env. So we could say export debug is equal to false. In this project, we want debug to be equal to false. So what would happen here is, let's just take a look at echo debug is equal to true. If we go up a level, and then we go into our side proj, what's happening here is Autoam is saying, this is the first time you've entered this directory, and this is the first time that you're about to run this .env file. Are you sure you want to do this? Because here's what's going to happen. It's going to export debug equal to false. So if we didn't realize there was an env file in there, we don't want to do it. It's sort of a safeguard on it. So we say, do you want to allow this? Sure. So now if we echo debug, it's false. It's what we expected because we used Autoam. So that's another way to handle environment variables, and you'd use Autoam for that. One thing to note, again, is that it's looking for a .env file. If you have any other name file, it doesn't work with that. It's looking for a specific file name. That's how it knows what to pick up. There's one other helper library that combines a lot of these different pieces, shell aliasing, Autoenv, and it's called VirtualEnvWrapper. And this is often mentioned in the same breath as virtualenv. What it does is it adds different hooks to be able to set environment variables or to be able to change between different projects. So real quick demo of this is, let's say we're done with our workproj 1 and sideproj 2, or sideproj 1, and we say make virtualenv sideproj 2, creates a new virtualenv, activates it, make virtualenv workproj 2, and now, great helper function here is called work on. Now we can just say work on sideproj 2, work on workproj 2. So it allows us to very quickly swap between environments. And so that's VirtualEnvWrapper. Now one other thing that I will note is there is a project, an open source project that is, probably have heard about it now. It has a lot of momentum behind it, and it's called Docker. Docker is often described as virtualenv on steroids. It's language and ecosystem agnostic, and it's beyond the scope of virtualenv. You can use virtualenv happily with VirtualEnvWrapper or shell aliasing or Autoam without ever having to touch Docker. But if you are interested in this, there is a demystifying Docker talk tomorrow that is at 12:10, and you can take a look at what that provides. So just to wrap it up, I'll turn it back to Renee.
Thanks. Thanks, you guys. So we started off today on our little journey into virtualenv with illustrating just why you'd want to use it. Maybe some of you guys are familiar with that awful feeling of realizing that the libraries you've used and exported are clashing with each other. We showed you how to use virtual environments to separate out your versions of a library, and we also showed you under the hood how that works, how they just set up separate directories and separate executables and library files, and that all they do is when you activate a virtual environment, your path points to one or the other of the directories. And finally, Matt showed you some convenience methods to handle things besides the dependencies problem, such as environment variables, and gave you clues to using Docker, which handles dependencies problems beyond the scope of Python. So thank you so much for coming, and I think we have time for questions.
Thank you all.
I'm almost afraid to ask this. Does this work on Windows?
Yes?
Yeah, so I unfortunately do not use Windows as a development environment. I used to, though, and I used to use Cygwin. So all the Python development I did was with Cygwin, and I can't remember, it's been a few years. What I did was eventually I switched to a VirtualBox with a Ubuntu installation, and you can also use something like Nitrous.io to have a cloud-based environment. What I recommend to new developers is every tutorial for Python you're going to read is probably going to be some sort of Unix-based interaction, and that's why I say use a cloud-based system, install a VirtualBox. You probably could get away with Cygwin, but it's going to be a little bit more of a cognitive dissonance when you're reading some of the tutorials.
Great, thank you.
Can you talk about some of the challenges of relocating our virtual environments from one machine to, say, another machine?
Sure. Do you have anything particular you want to talk about with that?
Well, it's just a file system helper, so as long as you export all the libraries you have or you're able to replicate them, moving them across machines shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah. That being said, I generally create new virtual M's if I'm moving from one machine to another. So let's say I'm in my development environment and I go to a test machine. There will be a new virtual env there, and it will do pip install of all the dependencies, and it's a fresh copy. That's often how I will approach it. But you probably could get away with copying some of it. I just worry about some of the side effects that could happen with that.
I think you're exactly the person that should be going to the Docker talk tomorrow, because I think that's a lot of what Docker is meant to solve.
Thanks.
Can you use the virtualenv for Python deployment for easy installation on host computers?
Oh.
So I do. I use a virtualenv on a test or production machine. That's often because I'm deploying multiple web applications running on separate ports, and so there'll be different virtualenvs for them to keep it isolated. As a large-scale deployment, if you're just putting one Python application out there, you may not necessarily need it, but I would use virtualenv always for development and occasionally for production if that, it depends on what your production deployment looks like in that case.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question too. What are your thoughts on the fact that VirtualEnvWrapper and VirtualEnv store the files that they use in different locations? Because VirtualEnvWrapper keeps all the bin and library files off somewhere that's predefined, whereas when you just use VirtualEnv, it kind of, I mean, you wouldn't want to say pollutes your project, but it puts all of the directories in where your project is. What are your thoughts and advice on that?
You can specify with VirtualEnvWrapper the location of the like the M's that you want.
So if you prefer to have it, like I often have a ems directory, some people prefer to have a .ems directory. So you can specify
so
that.
So you recommend using VirtualEnvWrapper over just virtualenv, or do you think that there are benefits to not using VirtualEnvWrapper?
I don't use VirtualEnvWrapper because I come from a background of Linux where I use a lot of shell scripting. This is really where it gets into the personal preference, and that's why I showed different options. Some people are happy using VirtualEnvWrapper. Other people would prefer to just use a more Linux-based shell scripting or Autoam, something like that.
Cool. Thank you very much. Does anyone else have any questions?
Thanks for your talk. Probably have to go see the Docker tomorrow, but I've been started playing with Vagrant lately, and the question I ask is why bother with virtual environment at all if you can just run a new virtual machine and get everything you need there, and that's your project. And is this a good way of setting up, or what's your comment on that approach where?
Well, the nice thing about this is that it's faster. You're not running a machine on your own machine. When I first started developing, I was using Vagrant, but it slowed my development down quite a bit. This is nice and convenient. You can easily throw them away.
Yeah, the idea here is this is very lightweight. It's not, the name can be misleading because you're not actually creating a virtualized system on top of something else. It is an isolated installation of Python with separate site packages. So I have 40 or 50 projects I've been working on over the last few years. I can just type work on that project, switch over to it, rather than having Vagrant bring up a new virtual machine. If you have something that absolutely has to be isolated and contained, Vagrant can be good for that, or potentially Docker. But for development purposes, that's why I really prefer VirtualEnv.
All right, thanks.
And I think that's all that we have time for. Thank you very much to Matt and Renee.
Thank you.